Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 4 of More to It. We're great day today. We're going to have a great conversation. My name is Todd Norton. Before we begin, I need to, of course, indicate that the views of this podcast that are expressed in this podcast are not those of Boise State University. They are of the guests and the hosts. So great conversation today. Looking forward to it. And I'd like to introduce, of course, my co-host, Jason McConnell.
Hey everyone, how you doing today? Turns out none of my views expressed on the podcast are actually those of my employer either. And so any sort of scrutiny that should be applied to them should come to me directly.
We're joined today by Kathryn Tay. Jason, would you introduce Katie as she was a graduate student and worked with you?
I will. I actually had the pleasure of introducing Katie to Todd not all that long ago. I met Katie as one of my students back in the day, and we've invited her on to More to It today to talk with us about a project that she worked on that she still got some interest in. Katie knows more about autonomous vehicles than anyone I've actually met in person. So Katie, what's up with that? How did you get interested in autonomous vehicles?
Yeah, definitely. So the first time I had even heard about autonomous vehicles was senior year of my undergraduate career at University of Wyoming. And it was just through a New York Times article that popped up on my Facebook feed, actually announcing the first pedestrian death by autonomous vehicle, Elaine Hertzberg in Arizona. And I remember reading the article and thinking to myself, like, I didn't even know this was available. Like, I didn't even know this was something that was present on public streets that people could interact with, let alone like be potentially killed by. At that time too, my minor was in philosophy. I was looking for a capstone project. And so where I took autonomous vehicles at first was into an ethics question. So a modified trolley problem where we consider what's like the acceptable course of action for an autonomous vehicle to take in cases of unavoidable harm. So does it protect its driver or, its passenger? Does it protect pedestrians on the street? Does it protect children, et cetera? So that's kind of where I started out with the question, was from an ethical perspective. But then as I was doing more research for that capstone, I got really interested in the dynamics and the policy decisions made by the state of Arizona and other other stakeholders in what happened with Elaine Hertzberg. So that's kind of where I took my thesis.
Katie, my understanding is I'm new to this topic, and so a bit of a novice. So if you could help me understand, my understanding is that there's a bit of a range of types of autonomous vehicles, right? It's not just that a vehicle is sort of normal or autonomous, but there's a range. Could you help us understand those types?
Yeah, definitely. So there's technically 5 types, 4 levels, because that first type of autonomous vehicle is a type 0, so no autonomy. So in that way, we can think that there's nothing for the car to control, only the human has control. So that's even more of a foreign concept when we think about cars today. A lot of cars today are in that type 1 category where one function of the car can be automated. So even just like a cruise control is going to put a car into a type 1 instead of a type 0. So, your classic Pontiac might be a type 0. But then once we get to any kind of car in the modern age, as soon as it has that cruise control button, it becomes a type 1. A type 2 is when 2 of the systems can be automated at the same time to do one function. So for example, like lane adapting. So when cars can sense where the lane is and send up a little beep, or even if cars can sense where the lane is and like do a little swerve to get back into the lane, that's going to be like our type 2. Type 3 is getting more and more towards full autonomy where the car can drive itself, but the human still has to have moments of like interruption. So for example, if we think about what Tesla has on the market right now, it's like autonomous vehicle add-on for its cars. Basically their advice, those cars can drive for themselves for miles and miles, especially on the highway. But they say that the driver still has to theoretically have both hands on the steering wheel, both feet, like one foot on the pedal, even if they're not actively driving. Whether or not people do that is another story. But technically, that's called a disengagement for autonomous vehicle language. So in a type 3, you still expect to have disengagements where the driver would have to take back control of the vehicle. And then finally, there's that type 4 autonomous vehicle. That's the one that's our science fiction understanding of what this technology could look like someday. No disengagements, no need for the passengers to take control. Some of the mock-ups I've seen of potential Type 4s don't even have a windshield. So you're not even looking outside of the car. There's not even a steering wheel inside the vehicle. So when we think Type 4, we are thinking like big picture, like Jetson style stuff, as opposed to the Type 3, which I think more people are more comfortable with at this point.
So, all right. I'm thinking about cars. I'm thinking about how exciting it is when, youngsters get their driver's license, first car, this kind of thing. After World War II, more and more Americans had the opportunity to own an automobile than ever before. We see it really as a driver of American culture. We see the interstate highway system. We see fast food restaurants with drive-throughs, drive-in movies. We see all of this stuff. And so it actually becomes part of the American identity, the freedom to drive, the freedom to go where we want. Do autonomous vehicles move us in the direction away from that to some sort of freedom from driving? Is that what this is?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And I will say, just anecdotally, in a lot of my conversations, not to typecast, but especially with men, I've noticed them saying similar things where like they have a real identity as like a car guy, or at least someone who takes a lot of pride in owning their own vehicle, operating that vehicle. People have, social and self identities as like, I am a good driver. And of course, like with autonomous vehicles, you would lose some of that, right? Especially if we consider that a lot of decision makers around autonomous vehicles are considering moving to a fleet model where people don't personally own a car. Again, this is like years away, but where people don't own a car, it would be almost like an Uber situation where you share kind of stakes in one car with the neighborhood, and then you call it when you need it, but it goes off to like a third area garage when you don't. So in that way, people could lose social identities as good drivers, as car owners, etc. But I think what I've been hearing more and more from, in my conversations with people my age, especially in Wyoming where the weather is really bad, is that people don't necessarily love driving anymore. They're worried about the weather. They're worried about safety concerns with driving the car. And so I know in my conversations with people, a lot of people talk about high-speed trains and how willing they would be to accept like a high-speed train from, like LA to Seattle. Now that I'm living in Pullman, that's the conversation I hear a lot. But in that way, like I do think that there's more of a conversation around not wanting to own a car, not wanting to have maintenance, wanting to be able to get onto something and just being able to take like a nap instead of having to be on for like 5 hours. And in that way, I think autonomous vehicles can really fill that gap that people are looking for there, while also taking out some of the things that people don't like about public transportation, like sitting next to other people they don't know, feeling unsafe, like someone might steal their belongings if they were to take a nap. So I think there's definitely a market there for sure. But of course, there's going to be people who will never implement because of some of those social identities.
It's interesting to hear you talk about sort of some parallels between autonomous vehicles and trains and whatnot. And I wonder, right, because if we look at mass transportation, of course, there were a lot of advocates in different directions. Could you help us understand the various types of advocates for different or on different positions for autonomous vehicles and what those positions are?
Sure. Yeah. Different kinds of advocates. I mean, first and foremost, tech companies are really interested in getting this technology out. So, contrary to my expectation, a lot of the people who are developing autonomous vehicles right now are not automobile manufacturers. Like we do see some development from people like Nissan, but the main autonomous vehicle developer right now is Waymo, which is a group run by Google. So definitely tech companies are very interested in the technology. I think that also anytime I talk with people who are proponents of autonomous vehicles, one of the first things they jump to is rights for people with disabilities. So in that way, disability advocates are, on a lot of teams for developing this technology, especially for people who are blind. So one thing that I heard from my conversations in Arizona was that they wanted to figure out, like their traditional drop-off program, but with an autonomous vehicle that might be able to move a little bit faster. There are still some concerns there from disability rights activists, but I think like that is one area where there could be a lot more research. And then finally, there's some state advocates too. This really differs by state since there's no national regulation for how this technology should be regulated at the testing level or at the, the marketable level. But Arizona, definitely, the state of Arizona is a proponent of autonomous vehicle testing, especially Governor Doug Ducey, who I think is currently their governor now too, and was back when I did my research in 2021.
To what degree is this and thank you for that. To what degree is this a technology advancement that's looking to create a market for demand, or to what degree is this a market demand that's looking to the technology sector to solve a problem?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And I do think it can be a little bit of both, right? So it really depends on how you frame it. Safety advocates talk about how, according to the National Traffic Highway Safety Administration, 94 to 96% of car accidents are caused by human error. And so in that way, there is some demand by the market for safer cars. Autonomous vehicles are predicted to to avoid like 90% of traffic accidents. So a 10% level of unavoidable collision, but 90% is a pretty high number when you consider the number of automobile deaths in the United States.
Yeah, that's a significant number for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And so in that way, I think that's kind of where the market is creating something. But like we talk about, there's also the tech guys who just want to create something cool and they know that they have people out there who will buy it. I think a lot of my conversations too around the add-on for Tesla that I mentioned before, people who are buying the add-on for Tesla aren't buying it because they want to save lives. They're buying it because it makes them look really cool. It's a prestige buy, right? And so in that way, definitely I do think that's generating the market. We can look at figures like Elon Musk with Tesla, who were creating a market for their product through like the prestige technology, through applying to people's senses of wanting to be innovators. So like the first people to buy an autonomous vehicle, those people really considered themselves like technology, not creators, but technology like right on the forefront. That's
like
how they should
like first adopters.
First adopters, yeah, diffusions of innovation, exactly. So in that way, we can see a little bit of that. I do think that there is a market demand for this, but I do wonder if more of the current reason why people are buying is for that prestige, for that creation by the companies, for sure.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, Katie, you told us that you got interested in autonomous vehicles from reading some crazy story in the New York Times about something really bad that happened in Arizona. Would you mind sharing with our audience that story? What happened in Tempe?
Definitely. Yeah. So I never know how to start the story because it is pretty tragic and there's so many weird avoidable things that like this never should have happened, I guess is basically the way to put it. But I guess to start by like setting the scene, it was nighttime. Elaine Hertzberg, she was middle-aged. I think she was like 45, somewhere in there. But she was on her way back from the grocery store. She was walking her bike across what we call an arterial street, which is basically a long street with multiple lanes where there aren't a lot of like crosswalks, stops. They're basically like to prioritize quicker movement for automobiles. But anyway, she was walking her bike across the street. The autonomous vehicle, it was a Volvo made by Uber. There was a tester in the car. The car sensed her, I think, about like 5 seconds before the collision. But the way that the car was designed was that it didn't make a sound. It really relied on the person to be looking at the screen to see that there was like a warning light. The tester was not looking at the screen. And basically, the tester looked up about half a second before impact, tried to swerve, didn't work. It hit her. The car was going, like 39 miles an hour. So it hit her. And I think she did go to the hospital, but she was like dead on arrival, something like that. But there were also just a lot of concerns. There were questions about what the speed limit actually was on that road. Some people say it's 35, some people say it's 40. So in that way, when trying to lay responsibility, that became a big deal because the car was going 39. So was the car speeding or not became a big question. Elaine Hertzberg was transient. She was without a home. And so there were a lot of questions about how this technology is harming people who are closer to the poverty level while developing a technology that's going to be for people with a lot more money. And there was also a lot of questions about what the tester was doing. A lot of speculation that she was actually watching the television show The Voice on her personal device as this was happening. Again, this is not any kind of public evidence, but the Arizona media kind of took off with the story that she was watching The Voice. So when I was doing my document analysis, so many headlines about Vasquez watching The Voice in the car. So again, just a lot of weird questions that people had about the whole incident that, in my opinion, never even got resolved by the official like NTSB report.
So, okay, that is definitely a strange tale. Was Uber the only company testing autonomous vehicles there at the time?
No, and actually, Uber wasn't even the most prevalent tester in Arizona at that time. The people who were testing more than anybody else is Waymo. Waymo was testing a lot more in Arizona than Uber ever did, but Waymo also had a lot more miles logged before they moved into Arizona. Both Uber and Waymo started testing in California and then were basically lured into Arizona by the weaker regulatory scheme than California had. For example, California required that companies disclose the number of disengagements that the car experienced. A disengagement is essentially where the human driver had to take back control of the vehicle from the autonomous program. Companies argued that this was a misleading representation of how safe the cars actually were. And Arizona said, you won't have to report that. You'll just have to report disclosed miles for the year. So in that way, that was just one of the reasons why they decided to move over. But yeah, actually Waymo was, I think it is still testing in Arizona and is one of the biggest testers in the country.
And so that actually gets right to my very next question for you, which is where does this stand today, and what's going on today in Arizona and other parts of the country? Does this type of testing just keep on going?
Yeah, and I definitely the testing is still going on. I'm not as clear about what specific programs are still running where, but I can tell you that as of 2020, Uber had not been really testing autonomous vehicles. They still own the like division that was testing autonomous vehicles, but it hasn't done anything in 2020 at least. So a lot of the conversations for them and for stakeholders with Uber is, will they sell it to somebody else, or will they continue holding on to it and do something with it, or are they going to stay where they are, where they own it, but they're not actually doing anything with it? And really, like, I think a lot of those conversations are coming more from a public relations standpoint than anything else. If you know anything about Elaine Hertzberg's death, I think those people are more skeptical about Uber testing because they've associated it already with death. So is there any recovering from that? I don't know. But another place that this testing is going on is in Columbus, Ohio. Columbus has taken a different approach to it than Arizona. Arizona was really allowing companies to test the product in order to develop a car that people could own, so a personal ownership model. Columbus has started testing autonomous vehicles in the form of their bus. So from a public transportation standpoint and being directly controlled and owned by the city, things have been a little bit different. People seem to be more positive about the technology there. But again, that's also like a fixed route. It's just different technology, kind of any way you slice it.
The story that you brought up and talking about Tempe sort of gets me thinking about the different types of populations and how autonomous vehicles might impact different populations, right? Particularly higher risk populations in different ways. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. So one essential part of my thesis was kind of social justice implications for the technology, because one of the things that we do know is that pedestrians tend to be people of color, the elderly, and children, you know, three kind of marginalized groups in society. And so when we consider that autonomous vehicles, at least at this time, will only be able to be bought by people with a lot of money, we can kind of see how this sets up and continues on a power dynamic between those with money And bare minimum, those with not enough money to purchase a car or have their own reasons for not wanting to buy a car, right? So in that way, I do think that there needs to be more concern at the regulatory level about what we do in the cases of human car interaction from a pedestrian standpoint with that. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
It does. I mean, I'm sure there's lots of, more specific considerations, right? But I appreciate, I mean, being mindful of those different populations, right? Because they all exist in a space.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
So, Katie, hypothetically, you mentioned the most advanced tier of autonomous vehicles being like some sort of Jetsons thing, some sort of sci-fi thing out in the future. Thinking about that, let's say hypothetically we move into some sort of society where autonomous vehicles are prevalent, and maybe it's more of the testing that was going on in Tempe for some sort of personal use than Columbus's bus fleet model. So it's some sort of future where people are buying and using autonomous vehicles for their own personal uses. How do you think that might impact the way our communities function? Is there some sort of big picture that we should be paying attention to?
Yeah, I think you can approach that question from a lot of different angles. The first that I want to mention is that if you remember, I said autonomous vehicles have been predicted to end 90% of traffic incidents. The important caveat for that number is that that's only possible once every car is an autonomous vehicle. Autonomous vehicles are actually a lot more dangerous when they occupy the road with human drivers because computers have a difficult time predicting human action. And we can see that in numerous ways, but especially in a car where, a squirrel runs across the road. The logical move is just to run over the squirrel. I brake every time. I have never not braked for a squirrel, and it's gotten me into some trouble, right? So in that way, autonomous vehicles would not be able to predict those kind of motions. They aren't able to predict any kind of spur of the moment, like wheel jerks or anything like that. So they're a lot more dangerous in the short term. In that way, I think that's going to affect communities because number one, implementation is going to be slow, especially if the technology stays expensive. So in the short term, we'll definitely see, I don't want to say definitely, but depending on where the policymakers stand on the technology, we might see expansions of roads to benefit autonomous vehicles. So wider lanes, longer roads, less traffic stops. And in that way, it can kind of pressure people to buy an autonomous vehicle too, where they see that this is how the city is being set up. And a lot of the same ways that we see with electric vehicles, where we see more charging stations, shorter distances between routes so that people can charge their cars. We might see some actual physical changes in the city because of that. And then, like I mentioned, in the long term, like proponents of autonomous vehicles are hoping that every single car will be an autonomous vehicle in the next 50 years. So that'll definitely change how communities operate and how they run. I guess the other thing I would mention too is that the smart city model. Now that we have autonomous vehicles, a lot of people are considering the next step to that, which is car-to-car communication. So over Wi-Fi, over like a smart city grid. A lot of people are interested in how will these cars operate with the city in the geographical mapping concerns. So like we talked about earlier, how does the autonomous vehicle know that there's going to be construction work? How does the autonomous vehicle know that there's an accident a couple miles ahead and to avoid it? That's going to have to be through like a smart city grid. I can't re-download information every single minute. But with that, a lot of people have concerns that the next step to that smart city grid is going to be full government oversight. I don't know if I go that far, but I know in my talks with other people, they mention like Singapore, a lot of the like South Asian countries who are doing more of a smart city grid model. I guess one of them can detect when you spit out gum onto the sidewalk, and then you can get a fine for that. So again, I don't know how much I subscribe to like the crazy matrix idea of, they're coming for me with my autonomous vehicle, but definitely people are worried that autonomous vehicles lead to smart cities lead to fascism, basically.
That's interesting. That's super interesting to me in the context of something that I heard over the summer, where a community not all that far from where I live, apparently the electric company in that area put a cap on the thermostat in the smart thermostats in the homes within their service area in response to soaring temperatures and grid load and that kind of thing. They actually capped what people could set their thermostat at so that they didn't overload the grid. And so, of course, this made the news because people were upset about it. They were like, my house is 80 degrees. I'm not happy about that. But it is very interesting how, as we automate, decisions being taken out of our hands, sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes it's not. And frequently that's a matter of opinion, a matter of perception.
Definitely. Yeah. And I do think a lot of the time people don't realize that autonomous vehicles aren't just about cars and it's not just about the road. A lot of it will have implications for how we choose to live our lives too. So one of the questions that I've heard from pedestrian advocates, or like basically people who are opposed to autonomous vehicles, is like, would it be acceptable with a stage 4 car to strap in my kindergartner, pat the car and let take my child to school without me? And so I think I'm uncomfortable with that idea now, but compared to something like the school bus, it's a very similar idea. So in that way, I think it'll change a lot of the dynamics of even just the interpersonal relationships that we have, as well as the things that we expect, like what the roads will look like.
Similarly, I was thinking about those sorts of rare but important occasions, right? So you have a anaphylactic shock, right? And you're in an area that does not have an ambulance, right? Or the ambulance service is a long ways away, and you have really no choice but to jump in your car and drive 100 miles an hour to the hospital, because literally you're going to die, right? And those rare, but those stories do exist, right? And to what degree does the car, right, and it gets to your central question, Jason, right? To what degree does the car or the system be able to relegate, or regulate rather, that you can't drive that fast, right? As opposed to, you being able to make the choice that you need to drive that quickly, otherwise you're going to die, right? And those stories do exist. I mean, rare, of course, but those, it's a population sort of issue. So it's interesting stuff.
Yeah, no, and I just quickly, I think that brings up 2 other ethical concerns that people have had questions about too. Number one, will autonomous vehicles be able to break the law? Can I roll a stop sign or California stop in my autonomous vehicle like I usually do to a stop sign? Can I speed? But also additionally, a benefit of the technology, once every car is an autonomous vehicle, they'll operate with each other way more streamlined than traditional automobiles do. So we probably could drive faster. We probably could go 100 miles an hour, like some kind of German Autobahn situation, just all the time within the city.
Wild.
Fascinating stuff.
Katie, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate having you on More to It.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Katie. The views, thoughts, analysis, and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the authors, the hosts, and the podcast participants. They do not necessarily reflect the opinions or views of Boise State University, the University of Wyoming, or the state boards of education for either Idaho or Wyoming, and no endorsement of the material contained in this podcast by those entities is implied.